And that's what I did with my experiments. I look at both physiological and psychological manipulation and the effects on perception of effort, and as a result, whether those changes in perception of effort have an effect on performance. And the thing is that when you use physiological, training, if people ask me, Sam, so you're saying that it's all in your mind, so we shouldn't train anymore. I say, no, probably you haven't listened to me properly, because you know what is the best way to reduce perception of effort at a given power output? Training. We don't look at
used to
it. We studied cardiac output, mitochondria. One of the most important, from my perspective, it is the most important effect of training, is that it reduces perception of effort in relation to the physical work that you're doing.
Welcome to the podcast, Sam. How are you?
I'm all right, thank you. Back in Italy after so many years in the UK. It's nice to see you.
Yeah, what happened? Did you get booted out with Brexit? What happened? What was going on? Did you just go, you know what? You don't want me. So we're starting quite politically, sorry.
Yes. No, but it's true, actually. That Brexit made me, had a negative impact on me. Especially during the referendum and all the kind of... So I wasn't planning to go back to it. I was just planning, just look around, maybe New Zealand, maybe Australia. But there was this opportunity to come back to Italy, and of course the most important thing is that in one of the best universities here in Bologna, which is also the oldest university in the world. It was founded in 1088, so it's 920 plus years old. So it's a big institution. It's 80,000 students we have across a few campuses.
Wow.
So it's a bit of a different dimension to what I was used in the UK, but so far so good. I'm happy to be back, but also nice to see some old friends like you from the UK once in a while.
Well, you had a huge impact when you were over here, and your research continues to be fascinating, and I'm really looking forward to kind of getting into the area. But you've got an interesting background. Why don't you give me the bio? Why don't you give me your kind of background? Because just before we started recording, you were telling me about your undergraduate degree being in physical education. So just give me a bit of a background as to where you've come from.
Sure. So first of all, obviously, like I guess most of us that are interested in sports science, the passion really comes from sport originally. But I'm a very weird Italian, because most Italians are into soccer. But my biggest sport, my real love, I played many sports, but the big one for me was American football. Because in the relatively small town in which I was born, there was the second team ever in Italy. American football team was founded in 1977. I was 8 years old. And so I started playing American football when I was 14, so quite young for an Italian. And that was my main interest. And of course, in football, American football, you do a lot of weight training and strength conditioning. So that's how I got into, to try to improve my performance, nutrition, all those things. But in those days, in Italy, there was no sports science. There was only physical education, which I did. But I have to say, I'm very glad I did it. Because, we had a lot of sciences anyway. We had anatomy, physiology, biochemistry, everything, all the sciences, to be honest. But we also had a lot of practical lectures, practical. So we did track and field, swimming, gymnastics, volleyball, basketball, a lot of practical stuff. So it was easier to see the link between science and practice. And also they gave you a lot of how to manage a class, how to deal with kids, so a lot of kind of organizational, kind of people skills that sometimes are lost in pure science, sports science degrees. So I'm very glad actually I did that. Then I did a military service, so I served in the army for 1 year, and then I decided I wanted to study more, so I went to the United States to do my master's degree, because as I said, in those days there was no other degree in Italy, which was at University of Wisconsin, La Crosse, Carl Foster is there, William J. Kramer, famous for strength research, graduated there. So it was a good experience. So my first time abroad, so it was really good. Then when I came back, because I was, honestly, there were people that studied sports science abroad in Italy, we were like less than 5. So,
okay, interesting.
So yeah, very few. So I kind of immediately found a job.
And what year was this? When was this?
90,
I don't want to age
I was
you,
97. So
okay.
end of the 90s. I mean, I'm old. And but I found immediately a job at the Olympic Committee in Rome. It's called a School of Sport. It's like kind of a Institute of Sport kind of thing. To support, I was in the research division of it. So to be honest, we didn't do much research. It was more, classical kind of sports science support to different Olympic teams, national teams. So that was a good experience, of course, working only for 1 year. Basically, for 1 year, I started the job that you did for so many years. So, but also, that's nice, I was exposed to that environment. But having said that, also I continued also being exposed to elite performance, because when I then moved to the UK, because I wanted to do research, so I decided to, and I got this studentship in Bangor, I did so Wales in Bangor, and I moved to the UK. But when I was in the UK, I also continued, I had a consultancy agreement for many years with MAPEI Sports Service, which was basically the company supporting the MAPEI professional cycling team, which was, I mean, in the 90s, early 2000 was the best professional team in the world. So yeah, I kind of continued for many years also in that respect. But then, of course, my PhD was primarily clinical, exercise physiology in Bangor, dealing with muscle wasting in a variety of chronic conditions. But actually, that's what prompted me to study fatigue, which is the main topic, I guess, that we will discuss today. Because so I was working. So my specialty has always been my concentration, because I've always done everything, but my concentration has been physiology since my master, including my PhD. So a very traditional way of thinking from a physiologist point of view. I'll tell you a very interesting anecdote later on. But working with the patient, when I was working about their muscle wasting, I noticed that they were complaining a lot about fatigue. So because I did a training study, so they were coming and they were today I feel really tired. It's very hard for me to train. It was even more bothering them. It was rheumatoid arthritis patients, so patients that have inflammation of the joints, so painful condition, especially if you want to do high-intensity resistant training like I did as part of my PhD. But this fatigue that they complained was a feeling, was a perception, wasn't the muscle fatigue, that we study in physiology, the decline in maximal power or strength that you have with exercise. It was a feeling. It was bothering them a lot. And also it changed. Some days they were very tired, some days they feel fine. So again, that cannot be fitness. Fitness doesn't change in 1 day. So that prompted me to, I need to understand better this feeling. And then the big risk that I took, but paid off, I guess, was to, instead of going down and become more scientific, molecular biology, proteomics, all these kind of things, to go the other way, go up from physiology in a way. And I did my sabbatical in the School of Psychology in Bangor, which was very good, School of Psychology, neuroscience as well, just to understand how they study the brain, their theoretical framework, their experimental methods, and then bring it back and integrate it with exercise physiology to have a more interdisciplinary perspective on fatigue that included the feelings of fatigue, not just the physiological aspects of fatigue. So that's in a nutshell. And that, of course, that changed the direction of my research a lot. And here I am talking to you about it.
So to a certain extent, some of the experiences, it sounds like you've had a broad background of experiences that have allowed you to wander, to explore, to try applying your knowledge set to performers in Italy, and then going down sort of a clinical route has got you interested but curious about, well, okay, there's a day-to-day variation. There's a perception that somebody is not able to maybe initiate muscle or continue to initiate muscle contraction for a period of time. But it sounds as though that lived experience with chronic fatigue has almost, for want of a better of a term, and maybe you correct me if I'm wrong here, but you've been able to eliminate perhaps some of the architecture, the muscle mass, the structures that are in place. It's more the initiation or the affect of that work that you were interested in. How are we conducting and how are we receiving that information?
Yes, no, absolutely. But I think it's also the main thing changed my perspective is that as physiology, you know how it is. You work with physiologists, you were more primarily a physiologist yourself. We tend to things that we cannot measure objectively. We tended to discard them because we like the hard science. We like mitochondria and cardiac output and heart rate and lactate and that kind of stuff. And I was like that. Absolutely. I give you this anecdote I was telling you earlier. People don't believe me. You can ask Roger Eston for confirmation. So Roger Eston was head of school.
Roger Eston. So he was he your
my head of school while I was
rating of perceived
student.
Exertion?
Yes, exactly. He was very much into it, more from an applied point of view, especially using it with kids. And because of that, he organized. I think he was involved with BASIS. He organized, these BASIS workshops that BASIS organized in Bangor with Borg. Gunnar Borg himself came to Bangor. It was like 2 or 3 days kind of weekend workshop on RP, how to use RP, how to apply to sport and exercise. And as a PhD student, I could attend the workshop for free because it was in my university. I didn't go.
What?
I didn't go to the...
Why on earth?
Yeah, RP.
Too much effort? Was it
No,
without
it's not
something
too much effort.
too much cliched about the effort? It was perception of effort. I can't be bothered.
Yeah, exactly. I was super cliche. What is this RP scale, subjective scales? That was at the beginning of my PhD. I was really a physiologist mindset, which unfortunately a lot of physiologists still have. I wasn't like that. So I could go for free to be taught by Borg himself about how to measure perception of effort, which then became not so much a measurement, the phenomenon, that's a more important thing, the phenomenal perception of effort and fatigue. And I could go to the workshop for free, and I didn't go. So that's how badly I thought about those kind of things in those days. So it's not even a 100. I mean, it's a full like a throttle because I obviously now, if you ask me, unfortunately now Professor Borg is gone, so I won't have the opportunity. But that's just how to tell you how much I changed my mind, and also how, in a way, many physiologists still think that because it's subjective, cannot be measured objectively, then it's not true science, which is a completely wrong way of thinking. Because perception of effort, we focus on perception of effort, feelings of fatigue, but this is a component of a bigger thing, which is consciousness, which is one of the last mystery of science. It's something that there are very hardcore scientists trying to understand. It's very difficult. It's very complex. We don't fully understand how consciousness is generated. We know it's generated by the brain, that's for sure. But it's a scientific, natural phenomenon like anything else. It's as natural and as worthy of science as a mitochondria or DNA or whatever. The fact that we cannot measure it objectively is a challenge, but doesn't make it less relevant. And as you will see, certainly not less relevant to performance of an elite athlete or any person, not just an elite athlete, soldiers and a lot of other people.
So do you have a working model for fatigue of which perception of effort is a part?
Yeah.
Okay, in a way, so could you unpack that for us?
Sure. Because in a way, I would, to be honest, if I could, I would avoid the word fatigue. Because it means so many things, and also these things are very different from each other. sometimes they are related, sometimes they're not. So, for example, we use the term fatigue. You talk to a physiology, it will think about, okay, the fact that if I measure your maximal knee extension strength now, then you run a marathon, and I measure your maximal knee extension again, it went down, and some of it is because of peripheral mechanism, and that's peripheral fatigue. Some of it is because you cannot recruit the muscle fully, that's central fatigue. And so that's a purely physiological. But fatigue can be, for example, you can feel tired at rest doing nothing at all. Obviously, that's not nothing to do with muscle fatigue. It's just a component of mood, and we call it fatigue. But then there is also perception of effort, which is something that you don't perceive at rest. Is something that you perceive when you do something, physical or mental. And again, per se, is not necessarily fatigue. For example, I'm a big boy, and Steve, I know you're very fit and stuff, but probably if I ask you to lift me, you will probably, on a 0 to 10 RP scale, you could probably give me a 7 or 8. You're not a weightlifter, right? So you give me probably a 7 and 8. That doesn't mean you are fatigued. It means that it requires, you feel a lot of effort when you lift something heavy. So even perception of effort per se is not necessarily fatigue. But unfortunately, we have to use this word because otherwise people don't. For me, fatigue, so perception of effort in the context of fatigue is this. Is the fact that, especially during prolonged submaximal efforts, they don't have to last hours, also even, few minutes, it doesn't have to be that long. But you experience this phenomenon is that even if you keep what you're doing, the speed on a treadmill or during a marathon or the power output on a bike, whatever, on a rower, over time, even if you keep that output constant, over time your perception of effort increases inexorably. Even if you do, so you may go some maximal stuff that lasts hours, you go maybe in a physiological steady state. But perception of effort, it may increase very little if you, over time, if you go a lower intensity, but inexorably it go up. And so that's the fatigue I'm interested in, is this progressive increase in perception of effort over time and how that can be influenced. Because according to my theoretical framework, which I call psychobiological model, because it increases over time inexorably, sooner or later, depending obviously on the intensity of exercise, you will get to a point where you will perceive your effort to be maximal. And when you believe, because of course there is also very strong cognitive component to this, that you're giving your maximal effort, then you think, okay, I cannot keep going. You cannot give more than your maximal effort, and you give up. And therefore, then you see, of course, that's when you have to slow down during a race, or give up chasing your competitor and losing, and losing the competition, or worse. So this increase in perception effort over time, that is the kind of fatigue I'm primarily interested in, and how this can be influenced in different ways. Because of course, if it's increased, then you will have a deterioration of performance. If it is reduced, you will have an improvement in performance, because it will either anticipate or delay the point at which you will perceive your effort as maximal. Of course, this happens in people who are highly motivated. Then maybe we'll talk about the interaction between motivation because I assume that the person is highly motivated. Otherwise, people will give up before perceiving a maximal effort, right? Yeah.
It's interesting that you say about that sort of, the annoyance or your discomfort with the word fatigue, because it's not always just a reduction in power or performance or skill during your performance, because ultimately you're trying to maintain the highest level, whether it's speed or whether it's skill execution, throughout. And so it's sort of almost like about sustaining that level of performance, or how and why we tire, rather than necessarily fatigue has a negative connotation throughout, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. But also it's an imprecise term. If I can use the same term for a dimension of mood, so feeling tired at rest, and the same word for a decline in power output due to, or the same word for an increase in perception effort over time, it's imprecise. So for me, it's too generic. And you have all the time you have to define it like we are doing now, which always takes a bit of time. But this is the way it is, right? So I accepted it that it's impossible, and people try to come up with an agreed universal definition of fatigue, and they all failed. So
Okay.
it's for me actually, also in terms of the practitioner or the researchers that are listening to us, I think it's very important when you read something about fatigue, is if it is original research, that you go, regardless of the terminology that the authors use, go and see what they've actually measured, the operational definition of fatigue. And also the problem is that in the discussion or the introduction to the paper and the reviews, because this term is used in many different ways, so for example, I've seen people talk about mental fatigue, which is another kind of fatigue, which is the fatigue induced by cognitive activity, prolonged cognitive activity, and they cite studies about central fatigue, which is like an impairment in motor function, in the ability of the central nervous system to recruit the muscles, interchangeably. So they use something about mental fatigue when they're talking about completely different. It's like me talking about, I don't know, the sense of taste and working memory, and use as a reference or a study about working memory to support something I'm talking about, the sense of taste. I mean, they both occur in the brain, but they're not there may be some interaction because memories but I mean, they're not the same thing. And
what's
that's
your
the
working
problem.
definition?
So
I have a similar sort of bugbear about when and there's been an exponential increase in studies that have labeled their participant pool elite. And I'm like, yeah, okay, let me find out what your definition is, and if you haven't defined it, I'll dismiss it straight away, because I'm looking for things that could be applicable or useful to transfer to elites. So if you haven't defined it, if you haven't, this is, the elite is in the eye of the beholder. As you say, that you've got to look at what are we actually measuring? What's the unit that's deteriorating or we're trying to sustain? But as you say, steady state in itself is probably going out of fashion, or it's just not real, because at any given steady state, something is escalating, something is declining, isn't it? Whatever intensity you're working at.
Yeah, but I guess at a very low intensity, okay, if you start to go very prolonged, and especially hot humid conditions, we know that you cannot reach a steady. But, in temperate condition, and, if you go not so long, you can reach steady state. There are situations in which you are in a steady state. Obviously, on the main variables, I mean, if you measure everything, something will change. But the key variables that we use to measure in exercise physiology, there are situations which they can be stable, at least for a while, for a long while. But perception effort is never stable. Actually, of course, there are also fluctuations, which are not very nicely captured by the kind of RPE scale kind of thing that we use. But as you know, especially for people that do more prolonged, okay, if I put on a bike at 90% of VO2 max, it will just keep going up.
It's just going up, yes, one direction.
But if you do like a marathon, for example, you can have up and downs. But the overall trend, of course, I mean, at the end of the marathon, even if sometimes actually most people slow down, even if you go slower than at the beginning, it feels harder for sure. But of course, during the marathon, there can be these fluctuations, which are difficult to measure with the RPE scale. That's why also we tried, but it didn't work. I mean, it worked reasonably well to be interesting in terms of the phenomenon itself, which is something I would like to explore more in the future, which is the facial expression of effort. And we use facial EMG. So we put electrodes. My physiology colleagues say, what the hell is Sam doing? Because physiology, we usually put the electrodes on the active mass, I don't know, on the legs if you're cycling. No, I was putting them on the face. What the hell is doing? because I was trying to measure the contraction of the electrical activity of the corrugator muscles, this muscle here. That when you do a lot of effort, you contract. There is a facial expression of effort. To see whether I could measure that in a more, it's EMG, so it's super frequent. But it follows the pattern overall, but it's not, at the moment we cannot use that as a substitute of RP, so there are limitations, but it has implication. Maybe we talk about the facial expression when we talk about the other study, but not even at low intensity, the trend is for perception effort to keep increasing for the same mechanical output, if you like. So that's a key. I think that's a key, because sooner or later you will get to where you feel, even if you're highly motivated, you will get to a point where you have to stop because you get your perceived maximal effort.
So if anyone's listening, Sam was frowning there, so it's the sort of frowning muscles, just if you're not watching on video.
I call it the corrugator, but it's the frowning muscle.
And that alludes to perhaps some of your other research around facial expressions, how they can influence, perhaps from externally, but it also alludes to your interest in understanding what determines perception of effort. Could you explore that for us and give us a sort of an opening into I guess this is truly psychobiological, isn't it?
Absolutely.
There's two factors here that affect our perception of effort overall.
Yeah, but any psychology, there is a quotation in actually Journal of Physiology. There are some gems in there, but they are so sparse and infrequent that most people don't. There is one, Ikai and Steinhaus, I think is 1961, something like that. And they say something, there are a couple of quotes in there, some gems. One of them is, psychology is a special phase of brain physiology. There's no psychology disconnected from, I call it psychobiological to make it explicit, but anything that we call psychological is physiological because it's generated by the brain. It's just the level and the kind of instruments, and because it's often subjective, that we use that are kind of different from physiology, but is the scientific understanding of the human mind assumes that the human mind is generated by the brain. It's like something that I shouldn't even say, but especially talking to physiologists sometimes I need to say it.
Yeah, and it's recognizing that it's integrated at the very least. It is a little bit pithy, isn't it? The physiologists that say psychology is unexplained physiology, but it's recognizing that there are neurochemical actions taking place that are governing our actions, our mood, our responses, and our recreation of stimuli for others. It's recognizing that the two can't really be separated out.
No, it's impossible. And that's why I call it psychobiological, but let's go back to specific to perception of effort. And again, that's where a lot of people get a little bit wrong. Like any, because perception, sensation, feelings are relatively, let's say, they're very complex, but in psychology, they're relatively simple constructs, right? Simpler, not simple, simpler. Because you have a signal, a neural signal, where it's generated, that's a discussion, but you have a neural signal, and the more intense the neural signal, normally you have a more intense feeling. So let's say, for example, if you pinch your arm, if you pinch it a little bit, you won't feel much pain, you feel a bit of pressure. You pinch it very hard and you feel pain. And that's where some people get it wrong, because that's not the only cause of the intensity of how you feel. Because that's a signal, but the signal then is transmitted, for example, for pain, there are pain receptors, let's say in the skin, you press them, they generate this signal, it goes to the brain, it's then processed by the brain to generate this feeling of pain. And then on the top of that is also how you interpret this feeling of pain, and if I ask you to rate your pain, there is additional processing, because you have to think about it, and then, okay, which number, so it becomes even more. So what we measure with the RPE scale or pain scale or this kind of measurements of how people feel, is there is a massive amount, just because we are measuring it, but even before that, but on the top of it, because we are measuring it, we are asking people to tell us how they feel. There is a massive amount of processing, both at subconscious level, biological processing in the brain to generate the feeling. And then if we ask people to tell us how they feel, and this is not just, about anything, not just perception, there is an additional processing. So there's no one-to-one relationship between the intensity of the stimulus and your perception. For pain, for example, there are people that feel pain in a limb that they don't have anymore. So just to give you an idea.
Yes,
and sometimes,
that's a great
phantom limb
example,
pain with soldiers.
Phantom limbs, yeah.
Yeah, it can be extremely painful. And there's or people that have no tissue damage anywhere, but they have this, especially chronic pain. So something can go wrong in these pathological cases within the brain itself that generates pain, even when in the absence of the initial signal that normally people have when they feel pain. So first of all,
and the very
please.
Just to pick up on that, is the very act of asking someone, how do you feel, perhaps whilst they are managing their effort and fatigue and uncomfortable symptoms, that in itself amplifies or exaggerates or it interferes with your perception of pain itself.
Yes, of course. There are several studies also in a way what we do, especially with the mental fatigue study, in a way we altered mood. And that can have an effect. We all know that. If I'm in a bad mood, surely any painful stimuli is likely to be amplified, and vice versa. But in the specific context of athletes where they do physical activity as well, for example, it's very interesting that exerting physical effort, so contracting your muscle, sending signals to the muscle to contract, will reduce the feeling of pain compared to, so if I give you the same pain stimuli when you're resting and when you're doing a motor action, it will feel less painful when you're doing a motor action. Because
that's interesting.
So there is both psychological but also neurophysiological level, a lot of interaction that can either amplify or, in the latest example I gave you, reduce the pain. Or, for example, that's during activity. Post-activity, for example, there is this, and people used to interpret it as endorphin-related effect. Now it seems it's more related to the so-called endocannabinoids, the cannabinoid-like substances that are produced endogenously by the brain, that they also have if you like, an analgesic effect that can last for a while, even after you completed the exercise. So it's complex physiological and psychological influences. And that's what I did with my experiments. I look at both physiological and psychological manipulation and the effects on perception of effort, and as a result, whether those changes in perception of effort have an effect on performance. And the thing is that when you use physiological, training, if people ask me, Sam, so you're saying that it's all in your mind, so we shouldn't train anymore. I say, no, probably you haven't listened to me properly, because you know what is the best way to reduce perception of effort at a given power output? Training. We don't look at
used to
it. We studied cardiac output, mitochondria. One of the most important, and from my perspective, it is the most important effect of training, is that it reduces perception of effort in relation to the physical work that you're doing. Because, by the way, perception of effort
and the duration as well, and that's something,
and the duration.
Training for ultra endurance events.
Absolutely.
What might have felt hard when you first start out a 2-hour ride, for example.
Yeah.
And sometimes now, when you're used to doing 5-6 hour rides daily, 2 hours is the warm up. It changes that effort perception of the time.
Exactly. So that's training is the most effective way to reduce perception of effort. And I think, according to my theoretical framework, that's the main reason why, and it improves performance. Of course, then might say, okay, some of the mechanisms, and we don't know actually. I'm planning some studies on that. We can say, of course, some perception effort is lower because you are fitter, you have a more. Yeah, but we don't know exactly causally, mechanistically, why with perception, the perception of effort is lower by training. I mean, obviously, we can have a lot of ideas, but they said, because you are fitter physiologically. Yes, but that's not a mechanistic explanation for why. And maybe some changes are more important than others to determine the change in perception of effort, which then causes, according to my model, the improvement in performance. So the thing is that, like the study with the face, maybe we'll get back to it. That's only one example. Perception of effort, it is manipulated by a lot of physiological manipulation, such as training of muscle fatigue. I did a study on muscle fatigue. Of course, if your muscles are fatigued, it's a primarily peripheral thing. Your perception of effort during cycling, running, for example, is higher. And that's why, according to my model, that's why muscle fatigue has a negative effect on endurance. It's not a direct effect, it's indirect through the increase in perception of effort. But all these things, then people will say, okay, Sam, you're just explaining in a different way what we've explained before, purely with physiological. Okay. I think it's unfair comment, but let's take it as valid. However, the thing is, because it's a perception, you can also change it psychologically. And that's on the top, and in many of my studies, totally independent from changes in the physiological functions that we normally associate with endurance performance, because of course I primarily work with endurance performance. So for example, let's talk about this, the facial thing. So what we did, I mean, from my point of view, the main reason why I did that...
This is a classic, by the way. I mean, for me, this is one of the most innovative, it just purely makes sense study, but it's brilliant. And I cite you nearly daily to people. I don't know if that's worth anything on your H index, but I will talk to other people about it. So give us the background of the study and the findings.
Yeah. So the background is my motive was to see, because there was a lot of discussion in those days about conscious, non-conscious, central governor or something inside your brain that non-consciously limit your performance. For me, it's more important the conscious component of it, although everything conscious, of course, has unconscious basis as well. But so I was trying to deal with that. So it was a purely scientific for me, not a practical. It was a purely scientific interest in my mind. And what we use is this manipulation, which again in cognitive neuroscience has been used several times. We've applied it first with endurance performance or physical performance. So what we did was, people may call it subliminal messages. It's more scientific in the literature called non-conscious visual cues. So basically what you do is you put images. We had images of either a sad face or an happy face. And also we had words called inaction words or action words. So action words would be like energy, go, and inaction words would be toil, tired, that kind of things.
Okay.
And so you literally flash them for so little time, and also you have some masking. So people were just looking at the screen for, that's what I remember, I think 5 or 10 minutes before the test. The test was a cycling test, I think it lasted on average about 30 minutes, or not a marathon, a relatively short.
Time to exhaustion test.
Time to exhaustion test, yeah. And
hang on for dear life.
Yeah, until you cannot, until you reach what you perceive to be.
It's as miserable as it sounds.
Exactly. And then also they were looking at the screen while they were doing the test. But what we told them, we had to kind of deceive them. We had ethical approval, by the way. And we told them that they were doing like a visual scanning task, something completely unrelated. That was only to make sure that they were looking at the screen, basically. So to engage them with this thing going on, they saw circles and stuff in the screen. Just pay attention to what you see in the screen. But what happened is that on the screen, there was these flashes. So they didn't see either the faces or the words, but they're consciously.
Is that they had a pattern? They could see a pattern. If when you showed me the video previously,
the things they used to look like, I call it like a Persian carpet. You know, the kind of old style
piece
carpet.
Of wallpaper.
Yeah, or wallpaper, like a fancy.
So that image appeared on screen, and just at a speed too quick for your conscious mind to receive it, an image was played, and that was either of a sad face, happy face, inactive word, or active word.
They didn't see them. Of course, we asked them at the end whether they saw something. No, they didn't. But we know from also brain scanning studies, using exactly the same manipulation, that the brain kind of register unconsciously those stimuli. And what we found is two things. That first of all, why the reason why the action in action words is pretty straightforward to understand why we used and why we thought that could have an effect on performance. I think it needs a little bit of explanation why we use the sad and happy faces. Because of course, in psychology there's been studies, but also from our own experience, that when you're sad, when you're depressed, in fact fatigue is one of the main symptoms of depression, and you're less motivated. You're less willing to give effort into anything. Or some people, in the case of very strong depression, people give up completely. Unfortunately, even on their own life in a way. On the other hand, when you're happy, there is also a component which is you're activated, you're full of energy. You're up, you are willing to do things. You are. So the idea is that with the sad faces, you will induce subconsciously a negative influence on the exertion of effort, and vice versa with the happy faces, you will facilitate the exertion of effort. And that's exactly what happened, because of course, they did better in the time to exhaustion test, in the happy versus the sad, and also we had a change in perception of effort, which is something that, in a way, I was sad to see, because I really tried that. This, I think, was the hardest. I tried to invalidate my own theory. So I said, what's best than a non-conscious manipulation to invalidate a theory which is heavily relies on conscious perception? But actually, once again, despite my best attempt to falsify my own theory, because that would have been very interesting, actually, even these manipulations, non-conscious manipulation, have an effect on performance by changing perception of effort. So the reason why it improved the performance, the main mechanism that we measured, that we thought, is that in the happy face condition, your perception of effort was lower than in the sad face. So when perception of effort seems to mediate this effect, it explains how things that you are not conscious of, you are completely unaware of them, can have an effect, a significant effect on performance. To the level that, you guys studied this, to the level that it may be winning or not winning the medal. It wasn't a massive effect. It's not like going in hypoxia at 5,000 meters, obviously, but it was, a significant effect that may mean losing or winning a medal, and something that they were totally unaware of, totally.
And it was such a wow moment when I read this and saw your research, saw you present it. There was a wow moment of the findings, but there was the wow moment of the implications of if and this is my working theory, and you can maybe tell me if there's any research that backs up conscious cues. It made me question fundamentally, how do I turn up? How do I turn up when I engage with athletes? Whether that is the words that I say, the energy that I greet somebody, the way that I prepare myself so that I'm in the best place to support and help an athlete, or at least prevent my poor behaviours, my poor mood, poor choices, being rushed, that I turn up and I'm a negative influence on an athlete, potentially making them go slower as a consequence of this annoying, distracting, unhappy person using inactive words.
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, I'm not fully aware of the research in that specific field because it's about human interaction. I'm sure that there may be some psychologists that are super experts in this area. But what's interesting is the psychologists I collaborate with sometimes, they did a study using not physical performance, the normal kind of cognitive tests and stuff. But they found that if they use really explicit, and then the experimenters know about it, the same manipulations don't have much of an effect when they are totally conscious. But that doesn't mean that you presenting, because they were instructed, they knew about it. Because in this experiment, we made them really unconscious because they couldn't perceive them. It was a bit of an artificial situation. However, you may call it subconscious. It's a different kind of unconsciousness. Sometimes if you pay attention, you see. For example, if I'm really paying attention about your demeanor or your facial expression, whatever, consciously, I will maybe really perceive and be conscious of the fact, I don't know, that you are in a very bad mood that day. But sometimes even the thing is, without paying attention, maybe you're an athlete super concentrated on your performance or training session, you might not, laser focus on your task. You think, okay, nobody else can affect me because I'm focused on my. They may still affect you because although you're not paying attention, consciously you don't see them, perceive them consciously, you may still perceive them subconsciously. That can still have a negative or positive effect on you. But when they're fully explicit, they don't seem to have, it's interesting, they don't seem to have the same effect.
So if I turn up in a laboratory or a training session and I start showing flashcards of smiling faces and look at this lovely smiling person, it's too overt, and there's a conscious override of what is he doing? Is he trying to do a thing on me?
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Well, the mechanism why it doesn't really work, I think there are some working hypotheses on that, but I think for me, from a practical point of view, that doesn't really work as much as, so it may be subtle things that only you are aware that you may be doing. As you said, maybe controlling your own facial expression, but without making it overt. Just trying, to be present you positively rather than negatively, even maybe when you don't feel that way. And so that's a possibility. For me, as I said, was primarily a scientific reason why I did that. The implications are many, and I'm sure there are, psychology which has a better understanding of this research on a broader human behavior that may be able to help you. But to me, the key message was that because the problem is sometimes a bad performance, and people tend to rationalize a lot after a bad performance. Of course, can be useful. Maybe I wouldn't do it immediately anyway. So the sports psychology might also tell you they might have negative effects, but I'm not an expert on that. But what I'm saying is that you rationalize only on things that you are conscious of, and this may open, I think, the possibility that as much as you can rationalize, you may not actually be able to really fully understand why on that specific day you couldn't perform. Especially if you really have to think very hard, that is not obvious I call it the good day, bad day phenomenon, which is something that I would really like to do. Some research the problem is very challenging because something that if you induce it is no longer that a phenomenon. I'm talking about this random also almost variations of how you feel, which then affect your performance. Because I mean, physiologically, you're perfect, you're in shape, you have eaten well, you have slept well, whatever, and then despite all of that, some days you perform better than others.
Yeah.
And
well, the opposite that gets thrown at me a lot of the time is I went out, I had drinks, I ate junk, and I came back the next day and I did a PB, and I'm like, yeah, but you wouldn't do that on Olympic final day. That's the anomaly that explains occasional variations in performances like that.
Yeah, but also I think, especially when you work in an applied setting, because when you do experiments like I do, we try our best as much as possible to isolate a variable, a factor, our experimental manipulation, and then we use statistics to make sure even the ones that we cannot directly control are controlled for, with the random allocation, etc., etc. But what you see in the field is a net effect of many things. And it may be that the day, okay, I'll do it, I did a PB after, I didn't drink, I didn't sleep very much and I drank. Yeah, maybe that was a very good day for whatever reason for you, random, sometimes it could be biological changes in the brain that you cannot, random, or maybe some external influence that you're not aware of. And the positive effect of that was so big that not only compensated for the negative effect of you being out drinking, but it was so big that you actually went over it, because you see the net effect of many things, not the isolated effect. So is something, of course, in practice you always have to be aware of, but especially when you can exclude big factors that may have negatively affected your performance. I think it's worth considering these things that the athlete, but even the coach, may not be aware of, and try maybe to be look for less obvious explanations, and including the environment and things that maybe may not be consciously perceived but may have had an effect.
So if attempts to improve mood state is too conscious, it might actually neutralize the effects. But so what can an athlete or a coach do to try and improve perception of effort during a training session or before an Olympic final?
Yeah. Several things. One is there are, some of them has been around for a long time, but not applied as much as they should. And it's from sports psychology. We call them psychological skills, but that doesn't mean being a psychologist. That's also important sometimes. To evaluate problems and try to solve them, but they go at a deeper level. But I'm talking about simple skills like motivational self-talk, goal setting. Focusing attention on different things that can be, for example, I've done a study with motivational self-talk, whether it works because of the actual things that you say to yourself, or whether it works by replacing sometimes the negative thoughts that you have, the doubts that you have during like in our case a test, an endurance test in the lab. It could be during a race. That's open for debate, okay? But regardless of the specific psychological mechanism, for example, we found that there was a significant improvement in endurance performance, and then again, that was associated with a reduction in perception of effort. Probably, we don't know because we didn't measure it, but the potential psychological mechanism is through self-efficacy, because perception of effort is a major determinant of self-efficacy, okay? If you go on a treadmill at 13 miles, whatever it is, 21 kilometers per hour, like Kipchoge, and you run, your perception of effort will tell you very quickly you're not going to keep it for 2 hours like he did, all right? So it's a people learn and develop self-efficacy based on how difficult it is to do a certain task. But it was the other way around as well. It's a bidirectional relationship. So and that's I think what happened. So by using motivational self-talk, you kind of convince yourself to be more able than what you are in a way, and that reduces your perception of effort. So people have high self-efficacy have lower perception of effort than people have low self-efficacy. So it probably works at a cognitive level, but the result is a lower perception of effort if you have high self-efficacy, and of course that improves performance. But that's a very important thing that is related to what we were discussing before. These psychological techniques, first of all, like anything in training, that, has to be not used for the first time in a competition. Because sometimes people are desperate, they try new things. No. For two reasons. First of all, because people are different. Some psychological skills may be useful with a certain individual and less useful in others. Okay, so you need to tailor also the psychological intervention to the athlete. But also, and that's something that is not thought about, which links to the next thing I want to say, is that it's like a skill. So you need to make it as automatic. You have to use it in training several times so that it becomes as automatic as possible. The part of, let's call it the part of your brain that the prefrontal cortex and stuff is a bit more complex than that, but let's simplify. The deliberate, conscious, importantly effortful functions of the brain. There are certain functions of the brain that are associated with the feeling of effort. And those are the ones that fatigue you over time, in mental fatigue. We'll discuss that maybe in a minute. So if you have to think about, what should I say during my motivational self-talk, or when should I say, that becomes a cognitive load, which may actually have a negative effect on performance in two ways. We can discuss that later. So you need to practice your psychological skills. Find the ones that are more effective for your specific athlete. There are many. For example, if you're interested, there is a book edited by Professor Carla Meehan. It's called The Psychology of Endurance, which different aspects. They also talk about all these different skills. But any good sports psychology book can help. But this one is specific for endurance performance. You need to automatize them so they become natural. During the natural. They
Not
will
just
never
special
be
for performance.
Yeah.
They're established in training so that they're easy and simple in performance.
Yeah, because then they may actually have a negative effect if you don't do that. It's like you wouldn't use a completely new tactical scheme. If you can avoid it. You want to use tactical scheme or skills that you've practiced a lot. Because obviously they will be slower, and also there will be a much higher cognitive load on you. And the cognitive load can have two very negative effects. One is immediately, because there is this phenomenon which I actually published recently with the military, of so-called cognitive motor interference. In humans, controlling even something as simple as automatic as walking, in an adult, you can see interferences when you do a cognitive task, like for example trying to remember things. Imagine in a more complex, even elite athletes, of course, is going to be highly automatized, but it's not going to be as more automatized than walking. I can't, you know what I mean? I'm sure you can get to a point if you're an elite that you can do a high jump and maybe be almost as automatic as walking. I don't think so, but let's assume cannot be more automatic than walking. And even with walking, you have this phenomenon of so-called cognitive motor interference. So that if you have a high cognitive load, your motor function will be impaired, and sometimes vice versa. So if you have a high, difficult movement, that will impair your cognitive function.
So did you say walking or working?
Walking. Walking. On a treadmill.
Interesting. So super automatic, innate
like,
motor pattern.
No, I wouldn't say
that's interfered
super innate.
by cognitive.
We learn it when we are children. We forgot, but I don't think even the most elite athletes it's impossible for sports skills to be more automatic than walking, right? Do you agree with me? I mean, so if walking can be affected by high cognitive load, surely any motor skill in sport can be affected by cognitive load. So that's why, for example, if you don't practice these skills, that can add to your cognitive load and that may impair your performance. So you need to make them as automatic as possible. But also cognitive load can have a negative effect because over time it will induce mental fatigue, which is another topic of mine. And of course, in the experiments that we do, in order to find out how we found out that mental fatigue has a negative effect on physical performance is by having people to perform a purely cognitive task on a computer for a long time and then see the effects of this during the physical task. And that's an experimental stratagem, strategy. But a lot of people have interpreted this as, oh, okay, you should rest mentally before a competition, which is, of course, that's very important. It's one of another practical take for coaches and athletes. Do not solely focus on muscle recovery and being fully rested from a muscular point of view. Also think in terms of, which in a way is more difficult to control, because cognitive load sometimes you can't, rumination and all these kind of things that it's not something you can as easily control. I mean, as a coach, to make you rest physically, okay, don't train for a couple of days, easy. With mental, it's more difficult. But you should try to minimize as much as possible cognitive load before a competition because, again, it can cause mental fatigue. However, what people don't understand is cognitive load can have also negative effects during the competition. One is in the way with the cognitive motor interference. That's immediate. But over time, the cognitive load of the competition, of competing, every sport activity is even the one that looks the most physical. Let's say just running for a marathon, just run for 42 kilometers. I'm not talking about being a quarterback in American football or, you know what I mean, super high cognitive. No, just running for 42 and a bit kilometers. That's highly cognitive demanding. It has high cognitive load, and over time it will induce mental fatigue. Of course, we cannot distinguish in that situation because the task is both physical and mental, so it's difficult to distinguish how much of the increase in perception of effort is due to mental fatigue and how much is due to muscle fatigue, which also increases perception of effort, as I said earlier. But it will contribute to this increase in perception of effort, which eventually will limit you. So it's the cognitive load before and during the competition, the control of that, the minimization of that as much as possible is key, I think, for performance.
Yeah, okay. That's interesting from the point of view of a couple of things, and I'd love to get your thoughts on some applied observations I've never really been able to substantiate, but for middle distance runners, for penalty takers, having a strategy in place so that there isn't the computation and if this then that, then this then that, and then there's an algorithm that they're having to try and work through. They've got a plan and they stick to a plan and maybe one or two backup rules if they need it. Can I ask you about an observation that I've made that I've never really been able to sort of work out, which I've just recalled when you talked about the kind of cost of that effort in your cognitive brain, the cost of that effort having a deterioration. So this is in relation to using sodium bicarbonate as a buffer. And this is for middle distance runners first and foremost. And there's an interesting difference for runners than, say, rowers or cyclists, because those tend to be sort of flat out events. Or they're paced, so there's not much variety. But whereas middle distance running, sometimes it's flat out, and sometimes it's easy, and then it's a sprint. And so there's a tactical race aspect to it. And one of the observations that I heard time and time again from people using sodium bicarbonate was that during the even-paced efforts, where it's all out, here we go, that sodium bicarbonate sort of numbed the pain a bit. There wasn't as much afferent feedback. It didn't feel as though it was interfering as much. But one of the observations that independently seemed to arise with middle distance runners when it was tactical was that when the pace started to pick up, they didn't like the numbed pain. They didn't like the numbing. They wanted to feel the sudden increase and have more perception of how it felt. It was almost like they wanted to push against the pain. There was it was a feeling of there it is, and I'm producing the effort that warrants that speed. I've never quite worked it out, but it certainly has led to a point where, as a physiologist, I'm saying, I'm not sure you should be taking a buffer under these circumstances today, because last time you did not have your kick, inverted commas.
Yeah, no, that's interesting, and obviously, I mean, first time I've heard of this, and there may be a better explanation, but it seems to tie up with one of the classic studies, one of the few studies, to be honest, before we started really to dig deep into the psychological aspects of a neuro's performance. Most of the interest was in physiology, but there was this classical study, I think it was 1977 or 81, I don't remember. Morgan and Pollock, a collaboration also between a psychologist and a physiologist, and we're talking about that the non-elite, sub-elite marathon runners, they tend to use dissociative thought strategy during the marathon. So try to dissociate themselves from the feeling of pain, the feeling of effort, fatigue, etc. The elite runners, they use associated, which say, if you pay attention to something, you will feel it more strongly, which is true. So you shouldn't do that, because that will increase your perception effort and fatigue. However, as I said, things are complex, especially when we're dealing with behavior, and controlling your pace is behavior for me. Okay, it's totally, it's decision making, is gathering information, reacting to what other people do. It's a behavior. Although obviously there is a strong physical component, but it's a behavior in the end. And the negative, you may have a positive effect on perceptual effort, distracting yourself from the sensation, but in order to regulate, especially when we regulate pacing, we need to know how our body is. Otherwise, we make the wrong decision from a tactical point, from a pacing point of view. So having the full information from your, in this case, nociceptors, about, I'm really, this intensity is really, making me accumulate a lot of lactic acid, because that's how indirectly you have that information when you are racing, is whether it burns or not in your legs. That's a useful information for the elite runners to pace themselves in those very fun and very crucial moments of the competition. And you may want to have the full realistic information about that. Having said that, I think in general, especially when the performance is prolonged, is pain. A lot of people thought the pain directly limits performance. We did some studies. It does. I mean, obviously, some if I can figure 800 meters, something. I mean, it's absolutely painful. But it's never so painful that you give up because it's too painful. I mean, we did study proving that. I mean, people are able to. It is painful, but it's not. I mean, it's not as painful that you would, kill somebody to avoid it. I mean, you can sustain it. You stop, you quit because you feel you're not able to continue, not because it's too painful to continue. However, pain can have an indirect effect, again, on performance, full perception of effort, and cognitive load, to be honest, because do something that is painful is cognitively more demanding than do something that is not painful. I mean, there are studies showing that, but I mean, it's pretty common experience, right? But because of that, doing something that is painful, or not even just painful, just boring.
Okay.
It's the cognitive load to do something like that, which is unpleasant, basically. It's not nice to do. It's cognitively more demanding for you to control your behavior, to keep doing something that is painful, that is boring. It's cognitively more demanding to do something that is not painful and that you enjoy doing. Okay, there may be situations where people enjoy pain, but that in general people don't. So reducing pain, especially in the situation, like you said, the more steady from the beginning, quite hard, and that would be a good strategy, because it will reduce perception of effort, because the cognitive load is less, and that will improve your performance. But yeah, there may be situations in which you want to have the full awareness of what's going on in your body to control yourself.
It reminds me of the conversation I had with Stuart Biddle about physical activity and encouraging the psychology of that. And you know, when you mentioned there about dissociating from pain and associating with the stimuli of intense exercise for elites and non-elites, it reminded me of something that Stuart talked about, which was in more relation that you associate the symptoms or the responses, the breathlessness, the discomfort during exercise as a good thing. If you're able to switch that into your mind as this is a good thing, and it kind of links to the motivation, really, I suppose, the motivation aspect of your psychobiological model. That we've been talking about perception of effort, but this also assumes that motivation is high for people and that they're able to push and dig in, or that they're able to respond positively to those symptoms of fatigue. You know, so how much do we need to know about the motivation side of things for you to be able to manage your fatigue?
Yes, but just before answering that directly, explaining how I see motivation, because motivation is like fatigue. It's a big word that means a lot of different things. Well, what's important, also what may differentiate elite athletes, but not just elite athletes. I mean, people are very much into sport from the general population, which is the one I guess you talked mostly about with Stuart Biddle, is that there is a paradox about effort. So we have this, and there are some studies from Boris Cheval in France now is done studies again that we have also an unconscious tendency to avoid effort as humans. Well, humans also other animals, because it's a way to preserve, and effort is associated with physical activity. Physical activity consumes energy, and when we evolved, the energy was not, we didn't have supermarkets, there was not so much food around, and also we had to do a lot of physical work to get it. So to have a tendency to avoid effort when it's unnecessary, because effort is when you need to get food, to go run after a bull or something to get food for your family, that's okay, of course, it's justified, so do it. But the tendency not to do effort when it's not justified, and justification is the motivation, we get to it, is a normal tendency that we all have, even subconsciously. However, at a cognitive level, more cognitive level, so this is very human actually, and this may be very important for the elite athletes, effort also gives value to what you do. Achieving something that is easy for you has less value than achieving something that is very effortful for you. So effort is, for us, maybe running a 3 hours marathon will have much more value than Kipchoge, because Kipchoge is like a warm-up, maybe not, but you know what I mean, like it wouldn't, for him, is nothing, because it's not effortful, but for us would be very effortful, and that will mean a lot. It adds value. So there is this paradox of effort as something to avoid, but also effort as something that adds value to your achievement. And I think this is very important for this. But the achievement,
they call that the IKEA effect. That assembling a product, assembling a piece of furniture, yourself, even though it's simple, but the act of doing that means that you have greater value. I think they call that the IKEA effect.
Okay,
Not that it's the same, but it's
no, right? I think it's probably the same thing, but now we get into the motivational aspects of all this, and in my model, the way I see motivation is according to a psychological theory, which is motivation intensity theory, which is about, it's a general motivation theory, it's nothing to do with exercise. But it defines, it's about the quantity of motivation. Most motivation studies are about the quality of motivation. Like, is it intrinsic, is it extrinsic, or what are the motives? Why do you do what you do? I don't know. I go to the gym because I want to look good naked, or I go to the gym because I want to prevent diabetes. Okay, those will be different motives, so different in the quality of motivation. There's not so much work and research on the quantity of motivation, because it's difficult to measure it. Really, it's more something that you can manipulate, and so. The quantity of motivation is how much effort you are willing to exert in order to succeed in the task. That's what potential motivation is. And I think in the context of an athlete, a serious athlete competing in an important competition, I think that's not really a factor determining performance, because all athletes will be willing to exert maximal effort in order to win the competition. So that's not what differentiates the athlete. Differentiates the athlete is the fact that Kipchoge can, when he runs for 10 minutes at 21 kilometers per hour, probably feels 0 to 10, maybe, I don't know, 2.5, and his competitor feels 3.5. So he will win, not because he's more motivated, it's because at the same speed he feels less effort and he will win, and the other won't, simply because of that, because he will be able to sustain that pace and achieve and feel a maximal effort at the end of the race, and the other one will feel it. Actually, that's another thing. When you do self-regulated exercise, like most competition, you don't have to get to the point where you feel a maximal effort to slow down, for example. I mean, you anticipate it. I mean, if I feel 0 to 10, if I feel 8 in the middle of the marathon, I know that I'm not gonna, so I need to slow down, because I'm not gonna finish the competition if I keep going at this speed. I don't need to reach, you know what I mean? You can anticipate, so you don't need to reach. That's important. But where I think motivation, in terms of the quantity of motivation, becomes very, very important is, okay, in the general population for physical activity promotion in general, but also in athletes, since we're talking about athletes, is in training.
Yes.
Because
so your assumption there is that everybody on the start line has got the same sort of motivation. The cliched commentator statement of it's now down to who wants it most is probably nonsense. The quantity of motivation is going to be high on the day, and that requires potentially the quantity of motivation away from the competition in training might be the variable that perhaps gives the most advantage.
There may be a situation during the competition where your motivation drops, because there are three main components that determine the quantity of motivation. One is the value of the reward they're going to get with your behavior. So let's say winning the medal in an Olympic athlete. The need for that reward. Of course, for example, I guess winning an Olympic medal is everybody wants to do that. But of course, if you have already won, I don't know, 6 gold medals, you'll need to win to win another one, maybe a little bit less than somebody has never won one. Okay, so the same reward, winning the gold medal, it also depends on your need. But let's assume that these are both maximal. The other one, the third one, which is super crucial, is it's called contingency or instrumentality of the behavior to obtaining the reward. So how strongly connected is your behavior with achieving the reward? So for example, if I, in the middle of a competition, it's clear to me that what I'm doing, me performing, let's say the Olympic final in the marathon, I will never win because the other ones, are ahead of me. They look good. They don't feel fatigued. I feel completely bad, and I'm in the middle of. So I know that whatever I do, I will never achieve the gold medal. Of course, there's no more instrumentality between you doing the marathon and you achieving. So like as happened before, I don't know. The Paula Radcliffe thing was a bit of a. But when you realize you're not able to, what's the point? And then, of course, you disengage from the task because it's no longer the task. So doing the marathon, let's say, is no longer is not get your reward. So what's the point? Is completely useless. So, but the thing that when you are at the end, the one that wants the most wins, no. Although there is a very nice book, it's called How Bad Do You Want It by Matt Fitzgerald, which kind of. It's nice, but it's not that. In a competition, it's not that. The other book I would recommend for the general population is Endure by Alex Hutchinson, also a very good book, also mentioned a lot in my research. So where it counts, I think, is during training. Because, of course, sometimes you also need to push yourself during training often. Not always, but often. And that's where the instrumentality between the behavior and the achievement is much distant. So because you may have to do a very hard training session now, and the Olympics is in 3 years' time. And so in behavioral economics they call it discounting, temporal discounting. The furthest away is the reward in time, the more discount, and the discount is massive, especially at the beginning. So that's where motivation can play a role, is during training. So sometimes you may not have the motivation that you need to exert the effort required by the training session that you should perform in order to improve your performance. So that's where I think motivation plays the biggest role, is during training, not so much during competition.
Okay, so instrumentality, when you've turned up and Usain Bolt is already running world records, and you're then thinking, I thought I was in contention for the gold medal, when actually now it's down to probably silver. There's a reality to your confidence and your self-efficacy that's maybe dialed down, and then you're probably over-relying on one of those other threes, the value or the need, where actually I want to do my best. I want to get a personal best, or I want to do my country proud. The other motivators that you might be relying on, as opposed to really being able to see the top of the summit.
Yeah, although I think sometimes there is a fine line, and that's where I think self-efficacy can play a bigger role. That's why I guess is one of the variables most highly associated with performance. It can be a bit of a self-fulfilled prophecy as well, because the main source of self-efficacy is being good at competitions. But I think there can be some truly mechanistic things, because sometimes it's the way if it's super obvious, like if you have a massive crisis, I don't know, in the middle of the marathon, like I guess, what kilometer was that she had the big crisis and quit the Paula Radcliffe? I don't remember, during the...
she stopped several times during the Athens Marathon. That would be the most famous, probably the Athens Marathon, but I think other factors due to illness would have had a factor there. Yeah,
but then, that's obvious, so you feel, and then you give up. But sometimes, and that's justifiable in a way, because you're not going to achieve what you... But sometimes, especially somebody, for example, has a very specific goal, and the line is fine between achieving or not. If you then have these negative thoughts about not being able to achieve it, and convince yourself I'm not, then you disengage, you give up, and then of course your competitor will win. Is that in those moments where things may go wrong, and how you interpret those, and how you find yourself in a way to cope with them or not, that can be the difference between giving up or continuing, and then maybe continuing, then winning the competition. And that's why you were mentioning these strategies, which I think there's not so much experimental evidence of that, but again, Carla Mahan, that I mentioned before, a former colleague at Kent, noises, St. Mary's. There is actually psychology it's called if-then planning. So to make as automatic as what you were saying is well actually a very good strategy, especially for prolonged endurance events where a lot of things can go wrong. And so having all these strategies already internalized and automatized can be very helpful during those. But also having those may, again, make you interpret in a slightly different way. When something goes wrong, you may be less negatively affected because you have the confidence that, okay, I already have this strategy to cope with it. Because in those fine lines, then it's not how bad do you want it, is how badly you interpret what's going on, and how badly or
you
nicely
control those negative thoughts.
Yeah. It's not negative, it's the interpretation of what's going on and whether you are confident or not that you are able to do something about it. So having these skills and also this if-then planning is something that can help the person to interpret in a more positive way and then not give up. And sometimes we know that sometimes there are situations where people would have give up completely. You know, there is that famous YouTube video of this guy kind of being way back, but then he kept going. A lot of people maybe would have given up. You know, he kept going and they ended up winning because the others went out way too fast, and he won the final. I think it was a 800 meter or something like that. So
that feels like a quite a practical technique in itself of anticipating when the negative thoughts come, or if they do, what are you going to do? What is your mantra or your reference point or your imagery that defends against that, or blocks or substitutes that particular choice, so that you're not you're in control of the decline, or you're reducing the decline or the fatigue rate.
Yeah, and a good sports psychologist can help you learn those and find the most appropriate strategies for you or for specific situations, because maybe the strategy, you may use different strategies depending on what goes wrong. So it has to be personalized by something that people can, they're not, in the study that we did with motivational self-talk, they did one session with a psychologist, was I think half an hour, and then 2 weeks of practice during training. That was enough to improve performance in a lab test of endurance. It's not, you don't have to practice these things for years in order to reap the benefits. You need to, to have some initial good support, but then I think that the effects, especially if you have already maximized, because that's the thing with these strategies, which are more kind of psychological, psychobiological, because they do not act through the same mechanisms. For example, I do training, I increase my mitochondria, I increase my glycogen stores. I eat a lot of carbs, that is going to increase my glycogen store. Because they act on the same physiological mechanisms to improve performance. They're less likely, if you keep working on those things, to add up, because they are on the same. But these more psychological, let's call them psychological strategies. They reduce perception of effort and improve performance through completely different pathways compared to increasing my glycogen stores in the muscle by eating a lot of pasta in a few days and rice in a few days leading to a competition. So they are more likely to be additive to each other.
Okay, interesting.
So I think it's untapped sometimes, because sometimes they're so simple that they're so obvious that people overlook them sometimes, I think. My research has alerted people a little bit more, especially physiologists working with endurance performance. Okay, maybe we should also give a bit more attention to the psychological aspect. So I hope now there is a bit more interdisciplinary support also to endurance athletes, not just skilled athletes.
Yeah, and that feels like an opportunity for the future in terms of what would be the hormonal response or the reduction in stress hormones, the sympathetic nervous system, parasympathetic nervous system response to self-talk, motivation enhancement, managing negative thoughts. where I found myself doing that from a physiological point of view, of trying to coach people to say, look, let's take a positive frame on this. Let's take the optimistic view, and then I sometimes get a bit of pushback to say, oh yeah, I've done that. I've done those mental skills, and I'm saying, well, I'm interested in you reducing your cortisol. Let's reduce the negative effect, because I'm interested in you getting in a strong, positive, anabolic, adapting state. And actually, sometimes that means that the athlete's switched onto it. Like, yeah, actually, I'm competitive to kind of create a different bathe of my muscles, rather than just trying to be high five and cheery about it for the sake of it.
Yeah, you get a buy-in in a different way. Because sometimes people can be put off by, in general, psychologists. It's for sick, mentally ill people, or is wishy-washy. I mean, I was like that. I mean, I thought like that in the past myself. I understand that, but I think especially now, the more we understand that what is psychology is actually our brain function, is as physiological, and as you said, is highly correlated with hormonal response. I mean, it's called neuroendocrine. Really, we shouldn't even call it endocrinology. It's neuroendocrinology, right? So the endocrine system, the central nervous system are intimately, I mean, to be honest, are part of each other. So it could be a way to get a bit more buy-in from the athletes. But definitely there are beneficial effects of engaging in some techniques, again, like yoga, those kind of the control of respiration. Also because, by the way, we found that breathing, especially breathing frequency, is highly correlated with perception of effort during all sorts of different, not only endurance activity, also intermittent activities, more than heart rate, more than lactate, more than VO2, more than ventilation in overall, is the breathing frequency. As the problem is very difficult to control it during especially high intensity exercise, because obviously it has a big automatic kind of almost reflex component, and it's difficult to control it. But if we could, in a non-cognitively demanding way, be able to reduce breathing frequency without reducing the ventilation required to oxygenate the blood, etc., I think that would have a very interesting effect on perception, positive effect on perception of effort and performance. However, it's not so easy, but I haven't done research specifically on that. But I think there is, especially with the breathing, I think there is something that again is untapped, because most of the breathing thing is done at rest, yoga, and there is a lot of value with that. But how could we control breathing during the competition? Very difficult, but if you can crack it, I think that could open up some interesting avenues.
Very interesting. Hey, look, we could go on and cover all other systems and that we haven't covered, but this feels so important as the direction that needs to happen at the intersect between our minds and our bodies. Because ultimately we perform. It's not necessarily the body that performs or the mind that performs, or separating those out. And so fascinating to talk to you today, Sam. The work you've done has just been, it's been magical to read, to think about the possibilities, the implications, ask ourselves the deeper questions just about, are we thinking more considerately about an integrated system rather than just thinking in one box versus another thing that's isolated, or that thing? I've taken a lot from this conversation, at least the fact that when I turn up to meet my next athlete, I'm going to smile, but not too obviously.
Okay, absolutely.
Are you trying to be too positive today, Steve?
Yeah,
No, nothing. So thank you so much for joining me, Sam.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you very much.